Welcome to the 40th episode of A Change is a Chance. My name is Ryan Lowe, and my goal is to educate listeners, especially the youth, on the most polarizing issues in this world by interviewing different experts who can lead us into the charge for change. First of all, being that this is the 40th episode of A Change is a Chance, I want to thank those who continue to listen to my conversations. I started this podcast in December 2019, 5 years ago, because I wanted to learn what wasn't talked about in school. I'm very grateful that the podcast has grown to this point, and I'm very grateful for all of my inspiring guests. And I have a very special one today. A month has passed since the United States presidential elections. The results, at least for those of us who care about progress in social justice, climate justice, and humanity, definitely did not fall in our favor. Many people, including me, felt extremely distraught and dejected, seeing that our country was not yet ready for a capable and intelligent Black and Asian female president who stood for progressive values. We rallied, we registered, and we reached out to those undecided to make our case, but the country leaned another way. The next 4 years will dismantle much of the social and climate progress the Biden-Harris administration has made, and will steer us to a system where patriotism means anti-otherness. The future for women, immigrant families, dreamers, and many people of color is uncertain. This episode will dive into what this uncertainty means and what we can do now to help in a year, well, 2 years, when the midterms come around. Helping us better understand the impact of a second Trump presidency is Mr. Jon Greenbaum. Mr. Greenbaum is a prominent civil rights attorney and served as the chief counsel of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. He has more than 25 years of experience defending civil and voting rights and has worked in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. Mr. Greenbaum spearheaded significant litigation addressing voter discrimination and has since become a key figure in shaping the committee's litigation strategy. His extensive legal career demonstrates a steadfast commitment to upholding justice and combating systemic inequalities. So, how are you doing today, Mr. Greenbaum?
Great to be on your show, Ryan. And you can call me John on the podcast, unless you feel more comfortable calling me Mr. Greenbaum.
If you're okay with that, I will probably stick to Mr. Greenbaum.
That's fine.
Just how I've been taught, yeah. So, firstly, how have you been feeling about the election? Was this the result you expected, and what were your initial thoughts after what happened?
Well, probably a couple weeks before the election, I started to think that it was more likely than not that Donald Trump was going to win, just based on some trends that I saw. One of the things that I've been doing in my work this year is for clients is focusing on what would happen if there was a second Trump presidency. And so while the results that night were certainly disappointing, shifted very quickly to focusing on what needed to be done going forward.
We'll talk about this some more later, but before knowing the results of the election, what did those strategies look like?
Sure. So in April, I left the Lawyers Committee and created my own legal consultancy called Justice Legal Strategies. One of my clients is Democracy Forward, and Democracy Forward had been working on a response to the document Project 2025 by creating something called Democracy 2025 and preparing in the eventuality of a Trump administration and all the various attacks on democracy, on progressive values, etc. And so I'd been in my work with Democracy Forward preparing for the event of a Trump administration months before the election.
Yeah. And going on from that, and you as a lawyer, what areas do you believe that the administration will go after first?
Well, it may be a lot at first, because one of the things that a couple of the sources, a couple of the groups that Donald Trump has been working with have said that they might issue hundreds of executive orders within the first few days of office of the Trump administration. And so that will hit potentially a whole number of issues, including immigration, civil rights, environment, also employment with the federal government.
Yeah.
Uh, Basically, almost as many issues as you can think about, at least have the potential of being in this first group of executive orders.
Yeah. And as part of what you were saying, Democracy 2025, what are some specific things you're going to do to combat some of these potential executive orders?
So some of the things, first of all, the executive orders have to be read.
Yeah.
There are a lot of them that we're anticipating, but we won't know until we actually see them. There will be certain executive orders or portions of executive orders that will likely be challenged in court on a combination of theories right out of the gate. In some cases, it may make sense to wait until agencies actually implement these executive orders before suing. So filing lawsuits is going to be a big component of the response. But, there will be other efforts too. There will also be efforts by citizens to try to combat this. There will be discussions in Congress. There will be communications, articles, interviews, etc. So the American people also understand what's going on and have the opportunity to register their views on this. So it will be a very active effort. The specifics of it we'll have to see based on what the Trump administration decides to do.
Yeah. And I feel like, as we've seen in this election, the social climate of our country has shifted to the right. So I think it's very important that we really keep it or really make a big defense on the legislative side. So, on the topic of that social climate, why do you think that America voted in favor of these directions and ideas? And what can youth like me do in the short term to fix this?
So this is certainly an area that I'm not an expert on, is why people vote the way they do. But I do think we're going through, both in the United States and in other areas of the world, a large level of mistrust with people who are in government, and an impatience with whatever political parties in control. And we're seeing it happen all over the world where incumbents are losing. In this last election, Kamala Harris may not have been incumbent, but because she was vice president, a lot of people identified her with what was going on in the Biden administration. And so again, I'm not an expert in this area, but there's been a general trend in the world and in the United States to be anti-incumbent. I mean, this will be only the second time since the 19th century that in 3 consecutive elections, you had the person who was elected be from a different party than the prior president. It happened in between in the 70s and early 80s with the 72, 76 and 1980 elections, but it had not happened since the 19th century. So it wouldn't be surprising if 4 years from now, the electorate shifts again. The other thing to remember is that it may seem like it's a resounding loss, but we're going through this era of American history where elections are very close, that we're only talking about a few percentage points of voters that flipped. And so what might seem like it was a mandate for voters really wasn't. It was quite a close election, which, as I said, the last several have been. So the effects on this election or of this election might be dramatic, but I don't think it shows that the electorate has dramatically changed. Obviously, the portions of the electorate have changed, but when you add it all up together, it was another relatively close election, and it was just a few percentage points of shifting overall. And in terms of thinking ahead for the future, when you're young, I mean, these elections, they hit hard, but it's a moment in time. And inevitably, there ends up being change. Now, in previous eras in American history, the political party in controlled that control usually was for about 30 years, somewhere between 7 and 9 presidential elections. So, for example, when I started voting, first time I voted was in 1986. The United States was going through a 24-year period where Republicans were in control between 1968 and 1992 for all except for one election. And so things are subject to changing again. In 2016, in the weeks before the election, in which most people thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win, there was a thought that our country was moving to the left, and that with demographic change, it was going to continue to move to the left, and the Republican Party was going to have to move to the left. So that was only 8 years ago. And so what might seem inevitable, oftentimes isn't very lasting. I can think of it like, I don't know about you, I'm a big sports fan. And when a team wins a championship, especially in professional sports, they can seem like they're invincible.
Oh,
But very few teams in professional sports end up repeating, because you have to have a number of things kind of go your way
yeah.
To win championships.
Except the
So,
City Chiefs.
especially when they play the 49ers in the Super
Oh,
Bowl.
yeah. That's a
But
great example of what you're saying. I mean,
yeah,
last year to this year, the Niners.
look at the Niners. Yes. Yeah. And then, to take a Bay Area success story, look at the Warriors. That the Warriors had this period of dominance, and they had a year in which they went all the way back to the bottom, and then they came back and they won another championship in a year in which it was pretty unexpected that they're going to win. So it's important, no matter how old you are, to realize that the changes are probably not permanent in any way. And as a young person, hopefully you've got a lot of life ahead of you. And somewhere along the way, who knows, maybe as soon as when you're in college, you'll see the electorate start to change again and the results start to change again.
I'm glad you bring up like this hope and this understanding, because that really helps me personally. So thank you for talking about
Mm-hmm.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people I know, this election has hit them very hard. And so it's, for a lot of people, it's sort of like going through the stages of grief.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and it takes a while, oftentimes, to get over it. But I will tell you that, at least in terms of the politics in this country and the dominance of a party, it's nothing like, let's say, the 1984 election, when President Reagan swept all but a couple of states. I mean, that election was a landslide. What happened in November 2024 is not. And within 2 years, the Democrats stand a good chance of flipping the House.
Yeah.
And doing that will prevent the Trump administration from doing some of the things that they want to do.
Yeah. That's good to think about. Well, back to the scary stuff now. Every other day since the election, we have been hearing news about Trump's crazy appointments. And it is really scary, at least for me, to imagine what this country looks like. Our public policy, our health, our education, well, really everything. Just what is that going to look like? So, what are your thoughts on what these appointments and incoming changes will impact for the role of the U.S. in global landscapes?
So there's certainly going to be change. President Obama made the statement not long after he was elected in 2008 when he was meeting with Republican leaders of Congress, and he said elections have consequences. So there's certainly going to be consequences before this election. With some of these appointees, they're going to try to dramatically change what happens in government. In some cases, it's not going to be so easy, though, because of the fact that the federal government right now employs, even when you don't include the military, like 2 million people, and only a small percentage of those people are political appointees. And so to make dramatic change, it can be hard because it's a small number of employees. Granted, they are the bosses who want to dramatically change what happens to a much larger number of employees. Now, the Trump administration is going to try to change that. They're going to try to designate a new series of positions called Schedule F, and those people can be subject to firing and replacement. Normally, in terms of firing career employees, it's a much more involved process. So it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen. It is going to be challenging. There are going to be some things that are going to happen that the two of us and many others are going to be scared about, appalled, devastated, demoralized, etc. But it's not just going to happen automatically, at least in my view, because of people like us and many others who are going to be seeking to hold the Trump administration in check.
Yeah. What are what are some of those things that you feel like will probably happen to us, theoretically?
Well, I think that, again, you're going to see an attempt to transform the federal government. You're going to see the attempt to do some pretty radical things with respect to people's civil rights or related issues, like the government banning the use of any DEI in the federal government, maybe as it applies to grants as well. You were talking about the area before we started, the area that got you initially podcasting, that was environmental. There will be dramatic attempts, in all likelihood, to take us steps backward when it comes to environmental issues. I very much believe, the Trump administration has talked about mass deportations. And so it would seem like that's going to be an early area of action, is to focus on mass deportations. So those are a few of the things, and we'll just have to take them one by one and see what we can do about them.
Yeah, but I'm glad that there are groups and people like you and lawyers and everything working against that. It's important.
It is important, but we're not going to achieve results by lawyers alone. It is going to require people standing up to what they feel is unjust. And we do live in a society these days with social media, not something that we had when I was growing up, that all sorts of people can have much greater impact on what happens in their communities and even what happens nationally than they could probably at any other time in our history.
Yeah. So moving away from the election specifically for a moment, one topic that I've been wanting to learn about is the impact of voter suppression tactics and gerrymandering on particularly climate progress. And I actually wanted to
Mhm.
conduct research on it, but there just wasn't really enough data available, not yet at least. But do you see this as a rising concern or other things regarding voter suppression and gerrymandering?
Well, both of these have been concerns, at least to me, for quite a while. Uh, Gerrymandering is essentially the manipulation of districts, largely for political reasons. Both parties have done it historically. It is more frequent these days for Republicans to engage in gerrymandering, and it has some very unfortunate effects. You see in a state like North Carolina, which when you look at the statewide elections, they're very close. They're typically decided by a couple of percentage points. But yet they've constructed the electoral districts in North Carolina so that in Congress, Republicans will get 10 or 11 seats in most elections. And then with the state assembly, they have a baked in majority because they've gerrymandering these districts. So you could have a circumstance where Republicans and Democrats get about the same number of votes in terms of their state house and their state senate, but Republicans have strong majorities, and even to the point of having veto proof majorities. So gerrymandering can dramatically affect what happens with the electorate and what legislators end up doing. And the other thing that they've done in North Carolina is the legislature's taken a lot of powers away from the governor
Oh, yeah.
because the governor is a Democrat. Vote suppression has unfortunately been a big part of our country's history, especially when you talk about people of color in areas in the South, but not exclusively the South, for much of our history. When you think that Black people only were really able to vote in the United States, especially in the South, only after 1965. And voter suppression can make the difference in elections, especially in places where elections are close. And the way that voter suppression typically works today is that it's not the outright elimination of certain people having the right to vote, but it's sort of more of a death by 1,000 cuts. Do a lot of things, each of which has a relatively small effect when you're talking about in terms of percentage points, but when elections are really close, it can make the difference of winning and losing. And I'll go back to North Carolina as an example of that. Is in North Carolina, when you fill out your registration form, there's a item in the registration form for you to identify your race. Now that actually, I'll say as a voting rights lawyer, is a good thing because it enables us to analyze elections and the effect of changes in the voting process to different portions of the electorate.
Oh,
Because we have the information, we can do more accurate statistical analyses. But in 2013, what the Republican legislators did was they looked at all the different ways that people voted, and those ways that Black voters were more likely to vote, or that would have more effect on Black voters, were things that they added restrictions to. So they added a government issue voter ID law
oh yeah.
because fewer Black people had the IDs. They put restrictions on early voting in person because Black voters voted early in person more frequently. And at the time, they didn't add any restrictions in terms of voting by mail, because at that time, white voters voted by mail more
Oh,
frequently. So they actually did this analysis where they looked at each component of voting, and they made choices in terms of how to restrict the vote based on that.
huh.
In California, so what we're seeing in this country is an increasing dichotomy between states that have added a lot of accessibility to voting and states that have made voting harder. California is one of those states that over time, they've done a lot of things to make voting easier. So California has had no excuse voting by mail for a long time. I voted by mail decades ago, living in California. One thing that's changed in the last several years is now everybody gets a ballot in the mail. And then you can mail that ballot in, or you could drop that ballot into a drop box, and there are all sorts of drop boxes. A lot of states have added same-day registration, where you can vote on the day that you register. And the states that have the highest turnout are the states that have one or both of those components. And then you have a whole set of other states that have gone in the direction of making voting, putting restrictions on voting, and not making it as accessible. And those states tend to have the lowest turnout.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say how these tactics can like influence the results of elections. Do you think that applies to this election?
It's hard to say. It's hard. Uh, it's hard to say whether the results of the election would have been different if if voting was accessible in more places. Yeah, that's a I can't tell you one way or another whether the election results would have been different
Yeah.
for the presidential elections.
Okay.
The election where it seems like it made a difference was the 2000 presidential election. And I know for you that seems like a long time ago. You weren't born then. I was actually doing voting work then. I was at the Department of Justice. And that election was decided by 537 votes in Florida. And you had a number of things going on in that election. Some things were errors made by election officials, and some things were more problematic. So, for example, one of the things that they did in Florida was they attempted to remove people from the voting rolls that had been convicted of a felony, which is something that is allowed under Florida law. In terms of people that are convicted of a felony, lose their right to vote unless they get it restored. But what they did in Florida in terms of the database company that attempted to match up the voter list with people that have been convicted of a felony was way too over-inclusive. And a lot of people that had not been convicted of a felony got removed from the rolls.
Ah.
Another thing that happened in one Florida county, Palm Beach County, is they came out with something that was called the butterfly ballot. And it was called that way because if you opened up the ballot, it had, for different offices, it would have candidates on the left and candidates on the right-hand side of the page. And the ballot was set up in such a way that it was very confusing to voters. And a number of voters, particularly Jewish voters, who would have never voted for him, voted for Pat Buchanan instead of Al Gore. And so but Buchanan got thousands more votes in Florida and Palm Beach County, did better there than any other county in the state. But most of those votes were probably intended to be for Al Gore.
Oh,
And so things like that, and the butterfly ballot, that wasn't an intention, that wasn't designed to intentionally mislead voters, but had the effect of doing that.
interesting.
The felony removal list, they did that in such a way that they were not careful at all. It's hard to say whether what they did was intentional disenfranchisement, but it certainly seemed reckless the way that they did it. So that's an example where you can look back on it and say, well, if the election would have been run better, it would have made a difference in terms of who won the presidential election.
Yeah. Huh. I well, I wouldn't be too surprised if there was something like that somewhere in this election. It's just maybe that's just my denial, but yeah,
Well, and this election would have had to affect it would have had to affect the results in several states
yeah.
because this election didn't come down
No,
to
it's
one state. And rarely does it. I mean, we've had a lot of close elections in recent years, but that 2000 election is the only one that if one state would have changed, the result of the election would have changed.
yeah. Well, last but not least, what can we do now as midterms approach? Well, not quite yet, but eventually to safeguard the rights that we will have left. For me, I feel like it'd be really great to work somewhere like the ACLU, but before I qualify to get there, what are other things that people like me can really do to help protect those who are most impacted by the second Trump administration?
Well, you're doing one of those things already by having this podcast, is that you are getting information out there to other people and you're learning things yourself. And once you start multiplying that times millions of people, that can have an enormous effect. And then related to that is just the idea of trying to get yourself in a positive frame of mind to realize that what happened in the 2024 election is not something that's permanent, and that the election was actually really close. And by changing the hearts and minds of a relatively small number of people, you can change the results of these elections.
Yeah, I'm I'm very admirable of how rational and optimistic you are about it. I think that is really important to really be able to keep fighting this. Yeah. As I had told you in my emails to you, just after the election, things really did not feel good. It just felt like all this work that a lot of people had been doing just went out the drain as the American people did not accept these values anymore. But what you're telling me now shows something different. I think that's really important.
What a lot of people did, a lot of people on a value basis feel the same way you do. It just wasn't a majority.
Yeah.
And like and I don't know the exact numbers, but it's basically the difference between 48% and 51%. So it's not a lot of people that voted differently than they did in 2020, even though the result was different.
Yeah. Either way, it still hurts.
That's the way it happens sometimes.
Yeah. Well,
And
thank you.
it, and it has consequences. There will be real life consequences as a result of this election that are going to be unfortunate for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So
Well,
you should care, but try not to let it not to let it affect what you do going forward and feel like what you're doing is for naught, because actually what you're doing means a lot.
yeah. I will keep fighting, and I know you too. We all will. So. Thank you so much for talking to me about this. I think it is really great, at least like personally for me, to get to talk to an expert on this topic, just to really go over what this means. It's already been more than a month, but still, it just, we're going to be dealing with this for the next 4 years and probably beyond that. But yeah,
Yeah, certainly. I mean, 4 years from now, Donald Trump won't be in office, or 4 years and a month and a half from now, Donald Trump won't be in office. But the movement that he's inspired will not cease to exist after he leaves office.
yeah. Well, for now, all we can do is, as you're saying, really just think about this optimistically and keep fighting. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for talking with me today, Mr. Greenbaum.
My pleasure, Ryan.